What if I told you that the next 48 hours could decide the future of the Middle East and possibly send shockwaves through the entire global economy? For decades, the world has watched the United States and Iran stand on opposite sides of history. There have been sanctions, assassinations, cyber attacks, proxy wars, and moments when the world came terrifyingly close to open conflict. But this time, something feels different. Reports now suggest that the United States and Israel are preparing for possible strikes on Iran's energy infrastructure, targets far more strategic than military bases alone. If those reports prove true, the consequences could extend far beyond the battlefield, affecting global oil supplies, financial markets, and the security calculations of nations across the world. The question isn't just whether another strike will happen. The real question is, why now? Why risk igniting one of the most dangerous regions on Earth? Why target Iran's energy lifeline instead of its military facilities? And perhaps the biggest mystery of all, is this operation really about Iran? Or is there a much larger strategic objective that few people are discussing? Stay until the very end. Because what we're about to uncover connects decades of conflict, secret military planning, energy politics, and a geopolitical strategy that could reshape the balance of power in the Middle East. And once you see the full picture, you'll understand why military analysts around the world are watching this weekend more closely than almost any moment in recent years. Wars rarely begin with a single missile. They begin with years of distrust, years of failed diplomacy, years of retaliation. One action leads to another. One strike is answered with another. Until eventually, the question is no longer whether conflict will happen, but how far it will spread. For decades, the United States and Iran have been locked in exactly this kind of cycle. Every American administration has tried a different approach: pressure, negotiation, sanctions, military deterrence. Yet the rivalry has endured. Now, after another period of escalating attacks, regional tensions, and diplomatic setbacks, reports indicate that Washington and Jerusalem are once again weighing military options. But unlike many previous confrontations, this time the discussion is reportedly centered on Iran's energy infrastructure: oil terminals, refineries, export facilities, the very backbone of Iran's economy. At first glance, that may seem like an unusual target. Why not focus only on missile sites or military headquarters? That question is one of the biggest mysteries we'll answer later. Because once you understand how energy shapes modern warfare, you'll begin to see this crisis in a completely different way. But first, to understand why the world has reached this moment, we need to go back to where the latest countdown truly began. Every major conflict has a moment that, in hindsight, historians point to and say, that was the turning point. For this crisis, many analysts believe we may be living through that moment right now. Over the past several weeks, the Middle East has witnessed a rapid series of developments: military deployments, heightened alerts, intense diplomatic activity, and a growing exchange of threats between regional rivals. Then came reports that immediately captured global attention. According to multiple media outlets citing officials familiar with ongoing discussions, the United States and Israel have been evaluating potential strikes against key elements of Iran's energy infrastructure. While officials have not publicly confirmed that any operation has been approved, the reports alone were enough to send governments, military planners, and energy markets into a state of heightened vigilance. Because if energy facilities become targets, the consequences extend far beyond one country. Oil prices can surge. Shipping routes can become more dangerous. Insurance costs for commercial vessels can climb. And countries thousands of miles away may begin to feel the economic effects. But military planners are asking a different question. If such an operation were to happen, how would Iran respond? Would Tehran limit its retaliation? Or would it expand the conflict across the region? That uncertainty is exactly why every movement now matters. Behind the headlines, intelligence agencies are watching satellite imagery, naval deployments, and regional force posture with extraordinary attention. Not because war is inevitable, but because in moments like these, even a single miscalculation can change history. And yet, despite all the attention on troop movements and military hardware, there is another battlefield that receives far less public discussion, One that doesn't involve tanks, fighter jets, or missiles. A battlefield made of pipelines, ports, refineries, and export terminals. It is this battlefield that may hold the key to understanding the entire crisis. And once we explore it, the logic behind the reported focus on Iran's energy sector will begin to make much more sense. But before we can answer that, we first need to understand why oil has become one of the most powerful weapons in modern geopolitics. Imagine you're sitting inside a military command center. Hundreds of screens are glowing. Satellite images refresh every few minutes. Radar operators track aircraft across thousands of miles of airspace. Naval commanders monitor every major warship entering or leaving the Persian Gulf. Nothing is ignored. Because in today's world, wars rarely begin without warning. They begin with patterns. A surge in reconnaissance flights, an increase in military logistics, the repositioning of air defense systems, the movement of naval strike groups, and unusually intense diplomatic activity behind closed doors. Over the past several days, exactly these kinds of signals have attracted the attention of intelligence agencies around the world. Military analysts have been trying to answer one critical question. Are these routine preparations or signs that something much larger is about to unfold? No one outside the highest levels of government knows the complete answer. But history teaches us something important. In almost every major conflict, governments prepare long before the public realizes how serious the situation has become. During the Gulf War, during the invasion of Iraq, even during previous confrontations involving Iran, military planning often began weeks or even months before the first strike. That doesn't automatically mean history is repeating itself today. But it does explain why every new report is being examined so closely. Because when tensions reach this level, perception itself becomes part of the battlefield. A nation may increase military readiness simply to deter an attack. Its rival may interpret that readiness as preparation for war. The response then triggers another response. A cycle begins, and suddenly neither side feels it can afford to back down. This dangerous dynamic has a name among strategic thinkers: the security dilemma. Both sides believe they're acting defensively, yet each defensive move appears offensive to the other. The result? Escalation, sometimes without either side actually wanting a full-scale war, which raises another question. If launching a regional conflict carries enormous risks, why would anyone even consider targeting Iran's energy infrastructure? The answer isn't just military, it's economic, it's political, and it may be far more devastating than many people realize. When people think about war, they imagine explosions, missiles, fighter jets screaming across the sky, columns of tanks crossing borders. But in the 21st century, the most powerful target often isn't a military base. It's the economy, because modern wars aren't won only by destroying armies. They're won by weakening a nation's ability to finance, supply, and sustain those armies. And that's exactly where Iran's energy sector becomes so important. Iran possesses some of the largest proven oil and natural gas reserves on Earth. For decades, energy exports have been one of the country's most valuable economic resources. Even under sanctions, oil remains a critical source of national revenue and strategic influence. Every barrel exported can help fund government operations, infrastructure, and defense spending. That makes energy infrastructure more than an economic asset. It becomes a strategic one. Think of a country's economy like the human body. Its military is the muscles, its government is the brain, but its energy sector is the heart. Damage the muscles, and they may recover. Disrupt the heart, and the entire system begins to struggle. Military planners have understood this principle for decades. Throughout history, nations have often targeted transportation networks, fuel supplies, industrial centers, and logistics, not simply because they produce economic damage, but because they can reduce an opponent's ability to sustain prolonged operations. This is why discussions about energy infrastructure draw so much attention, not because they guarantee victory, but because they can reshape the strategic environment in ways that purely military strikes sometimes cannot. Yet such actions also carry enormous risks. Energy facilities are deeply connected to global markets. A disruption in one region can influence prices, supply chains, and investor confidence around the world. And nowhere is that connection more visible than in one narrow stretch of water that has become one of the world's most strategically important choke points, a place through which a significant share of the world's seaborne oil trade passes, a place whose name has become synonymous with geopolitical tension, the Strait of Hormuz. If conflict spreads there, the consequences would not stop at the Middle East. They could be felt in Europe, Asia, North America, and almost every country that depends on stable energy supplies. But here's where the story takes an even more surprising turn. Because oil itself may not be the ultimate objective. Instead, it could be part of a much larger strategy designed to influence decisions far beyond Iran's borders. And to understand that possibility, we first need to examine the strategic thinking inside Washington. For thousands of years, empires fought over land. In the 20th century, they fought over ideology. But in the 21st century, one of the most valuable strategic assets is something many people never see: energy. It powers economies, moves armies, keeps factories running, and determines whether nations can endure a prolonged crisis. That is why any discussion of Iran's energy infrastructure immediately draws global attention. It's not simply because of what happens inside Iran. It's because the effects could ripple far beyond its borders. Picture the Persian Gulf from above. Thousands of commercial vessels move through these waters every year. Many are carrying crude oil and liquefied natural gas to markets across Asia, Europe, and beyond. Every day, energy flows through this region, help power homes, factories, hospitals, airlines, and industries across the globe. Now imagine that flow being interrupted, even briefly. Insurance costs for shipping could rise. Energy traders would react. Governments might begin assessing emergency reserves. Financial markets could respond with increased volatility. The world has seen before how geopolitical tensions in the Gulf can influence global energy prices. That is why military planners think beyond the battlefield. A strike isn't judged only by the physical damage it causes. It's judged by the political, economic, and psychological effects that follow. Sometimes the possibility of disruption can influence decision-making even before any action occurs. This is why every headline about the Persian Gulf is watched so closely by governments and markets alike. But while much of the world's attention focuses on oil, inside Washington, another conversation has reportedly been taking place, one that is less about barrels of crude and more about long-term strategy, because every military option raises a larger question. What is the desired end state? Is the objective deterrence, de-escalation through pressure, or something else entirely? To answer that, we need to step inside the strategic calculations shaping decisions in the White House and the Pentagon. When people hear about military planning, they often imagine generals gathered around maps discussing targets and troop movements. But modern strategy begins long before that. It starts with one deceptively simple question: what are we trying to achieve? Military force is a tool, not an objective. Every operation carries risks, costs, and consequences. That means policymakers must weigh not only what they can do, but what they should do. In the case of Iran, the challenge is unusually complex. The United States has spent decades balancing multiple priorities in the Middle East: protecting regional partners, safeguarding international shipping routes, deterring attacks on U.S. personnel and facilities, preventing wider regional instability, and supporting diplomatic efforts when possible. These goals can sometimes reinforce one another, but they can also come into tension. A stronger military response may increase deterrence, yet it can also raise the risk of escalation. A restrained response may reduce immediate tensions, but it can also be interpreted by adversaries as a sign of hesitation. This balancing act is one of the most difficult challenges in national security. Every decision sends a message, not only to Iran, but also to allies, competitors, and the wider international community. That is why every reported military option is analyzed through multiple lenses: military effectiveness, political consequences, economic impact, regional stability, and perhaps most importantly, what comes after the first strike. Because history has shown something again and again: starting military action is often easier than controlling what follows. One retaliation leads to another. Each side seeks to restore deterrence. Each believes it must respond. And with every step, the room for diplomacy becomes smaller. This is why strategic planners often spend as much time discussing the aftermath as the operation itself. Not because they expect the worst, but because they must prepare for every possibility. Yet there is another layer to this story, one that rarely appears in headlines, a layer shaped not only by military considerations, but by alliances, regional security, and the perception of time running out. Because while Washington evaluates its options, there is another capital watching the situation with equal intensity, Jerusalem. And for Israel, the stakes may look very different. But to understand why, we first need to explore what Israeli leaders see when they look toward Iran, and why they believe the strategic clock may be ticking faster than the rest of the world realizes. There is a saying often repeated in military academies: the enemy gets a vote. No matter how carefully a strategy is designed, no plan survives unchanged once another nation begins making decisions of its own. That is exactly what makes the current crisis so unpredictable. If military pressure increases, Iran may choose restraint, or it may decide that restraint encourages further pressure. Neither outcome can be assumed. And that uncertainty sits at the center of every discussion inside Washington. For U.S. decision-makers, military action is not simply about today's headlines. It is about shaping tomorrow's strategic environment. Can deterrence be restored? Can allies be reassured? Can shipping lanes remain secure? Can further escalation be avoided? These questions rarely have simple answers, because every option creates new risks. History offers many examples where limited military operations achieved their immediate objectives, but also produce long-term consequences that planners had not fully anticipated. That is why strategy is often described as a game of chess rather than checkers. Every move is made while anticipating several possible responses. Not one, not two, but dozens. And in today's Middle East, the chessboard is crowded. Every major player is watching. Every decision is being analyzed. Every signal is being interpreted, which brings us to perhaps the most important ally in America's regional strategy: Israel. For years, Israeli leaders have argued that the threat posed by Iran extends beyond direct military confrontation. From their perspective, the challenge includes regional influence, missile capabilities, and the activities of armed groups allied with Tehran. Whether one agrees with that assessment or not, it has profoundly shaped Israel's national security planning, and it helps explain why events unfolding today are viewed in Jerusalem through a very different lens than in many other capitals. To understand Israel's calculations, you first have to understand geography. Israel is a relatively small country. At its narrowest point, it is only a few kilometers wide. For Israeli military planners, that means reaction time is measured not in days, but sometimes in minutes. Unlike larger nations that possess vast strategic depth, Israel has long viewed early warning, intelligence, and deterrence as essential pillars of its national security. This mindset has influenced decades of military doctrine. Every potential threat is evaluated not only by its current capability, but by what it could become in the future. From Israel's perspective, waiting until a threat fully materializes may carry unacceptable risks. That belief has shaped many of its past security decisions. Today, Israeli officials continue to express concern about Iran's missile programs, regional influence, and support for allied armed groups across the Middle East. These concerns have been stated publicly for years. Supporters argue that strong deterrence is necessary to prevent future conflict. Critics argue that military pressure can increase instability and reduce opportunities for diplomacy. The debate remains one of the most contested issues in international politics. But regardless of political opinion, one fact is clear: Israel views developments inside Iran through the lens of long-term national security, and that perspective affects every strategic conversation taking place today. Yet Israel is not focused only on Iran itself. Military planners also consider the broader regional picture, because in modern conflict, a confrontation rarely stays confined to one border. Instead, it can involve multiple fronts, multiple actors, and multiple forms of warfare: missiles, drones, cyber operations, information campaigns, maritime security, each connected to the others, which raises another critical question. If tensions were to escalate dramatically, how might Iran respond? Would the response remain limited, Or would it involve a much broader regional network? To answer that, we need to examine Iran's own strategic doctrine, because Tehran has spent decades preparing for scenarios exactly like this. And understanding that preparation may be the key to understanding what happens next. There is one mistake that military planners try very hard to avoid: underestimating their opponent. History is filled with examples of nations that believed a conflict would be short, only to discover that the other side had prepared for years. Iran's military doctrine has evolved under decades of sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and repeated security crises. Rather than attempting to match larger militaries aircraft for aircraft or ship for ship, Iran has invested heavily in capabilities designed to complicate an opponent's planning. This approach is often described as asymmetric warfare. Instead of relying on overwhelming conventional power, it seeks to increase the cost and uncertainty of any military confrontation. Imagine you're an opposing commander. You may know where some military bases are. You may know the location of certain airfields. But can you be certain you've identified every mobile missile launcher, every drone unit, every underground storage facility, every cyber capability? That uncertainty itself becomes part of the strategy. Because in modern warfare, the unknown can be just as powerful as the known. For years, Iran has publicly showcased a range of ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and unmanned aerial systems. Officials describe these capabilities as essential for national defense and deterrence. Independent analysts continue to debate their exact effectiveness, but there is broad agreement that missiles and drones have become central elements of Iran's military posture. Why? Because they allow a country to project force over long distances without relying exclusively on traditional air power. And in recent conflicts around the world, drones have demonstrated how relatively inexpensive systems can influence much larger military operations. The battlefield has changed. Technology has changed. The cost of war has changed. But missiles and drones tell only part of the story. Iran's strategy is also built around geography. Look at a map. To the north, mountain ranges. To the south, the Persian Gulf. And just beyond it, one of the world's most strategically significant waterways, the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow passage has long been viewed as one of the most important maritime choke points on Earth. A substantial portion of globally traded seaborne oil passes through it. If shipping there becomes more dangerous, the consequences could extend far beyond the Middle East. Energy markets, shipping companies, importing nations, financial institutions, all begin paying close attention. This is why any discussion involving the Strait of Hormuz attracts immediate international interest. Not because disruption is inevitable, but because the possibility alone can influence global calculations. Now imagine the pressure facing decision makers. One side wants to demonstrate resolve, the other wants to avoid appearing weak. Each believes credibility matters. Each fears that backing down could invite future challenges. This is where crises become especially dangerous. Not because leaders necessarily seek war, but because each side is trying to prevent the other from believing it can act without consequences. Deterrence and miscalculation can exist side by side, yet there is another dimension that often receives less public attention: cyber operations. Today's conflicts do not exist only on land, at sea, or in the air. They also unfold across digital networks. Governments around the world invest heavily in cyber capabilities for intelligence gathering, defense, and, in some cases, offensive operations. Details about specific capabilities are often classified or disputed, making public claims difficult to verify. But one thing is widely accepted: modern conflict increasingly includes a digital domain. Power grids, communication systems, transportation networks, financial infrastructure, all have become areas of strategic concern. A future crisis, if it were to deepen, would likely involve far more than conventional military operations alone. And then there is the regional picture. The Middle East is connected through alliances, rivalries, diplomacy, trade, and security partnerships. Events in one country can quickly affect neighboring states. That interconnected reality is one reason why governments around the world consistently call for restraint during periods of heightened tension. Because history has shown that regional crises can spread in ways few initially expect. Which brings us to the question that has worried economists, diplomats, and military strategists alike. If tensions continue to rise, could the consequences extend beyond the Middle East? Could they affect global markets, international security, relations among the world's major powers? The answer is more complicated than many headlines suggest, and it takes us to the final major chapter of this story, a chapter where every move on the regional chessboard intersects with global politics. Because what happens next may not depend solely on Washington, Tehran, or Jerusalem. It may also depend on how the rest of the world responds. When most people hear the words U.S.-Iran conflict, they imagine a regional war, the Middle East, the Persian Gulf, Israel, Iran, American military bases. But history tells us something very different. Regional conflicts rarely remain regional for long, not because countries want a larger war, but because today's world is deeply interconnected. An attack in one part of the world can disrupt energy supplies thousands of miles away. A cyber incident can affect financial markets on another continent. A single diplomatic decision can alter alliances that took decades to build. In the modern era, no major geopolitical crisis exists in isolation, and that's exactly why governments from Europe to Asia are watching every new development with extraordinary attention. Imagine a row of dominoes stretching across the globe. The first domino stands in the Persian Gulf, the second, global energy markets, the third, international shipping, the fourth, inflation, the fifth, economic growth. None of these dominoes may fall, but policymakers prepare because they know they could. That is why financial markets react not only to events, but to expectations. Sometimes uncertainty itself becomes an economic force. Investors delay decisions, companies reassess supply chains, governments review emergency plans, not because they know what will happen, but because they don't. Now consider another layer. Diplomacy. Whenever tensions rise, governments around the world begin an intense round of consultations. Allies exchange intelligence. Foreign ministers hold emergency calls. Military commanders coordinate defensive planning. International organizations urge restraint. Behind closed doors, negotiations often continue even while public rhetoric grows sharper. History has repeatedly shown that some of the most important diplomatic conversations happen when cameras are turned off. Because even during periods of maximum tension, most governments still seek ways to prevent unintended escalation. Then there are the world's major powers. Each has its own national interests, its own economic priorities, its own regional relationships. Some seek stability to protect trade. Others focus on regional partnerships. Still others emphasize diplomacy, deterrence, or international law. Those priorities don't always align, and that's why global crises become so difficult to manage. Every capital views the same event through a different strategic lens. What one country sees as deterrence, another may see as escalation. What one government considers necessary, another may consider dangerous. This difference in perception is one of the defining challenges of modern geopolitics. Now imagine you're responsible for protecting millions of citizens. Do you wait or act? Do you increase military readiness or emphasize diplomacy? Every decision carries consequences. Every delay has risks. Every action creates new calculations. There are rarely perfect choices, only difficult ones. And that is why the current crisis has become far more than a military story. It is also a story about economics, energy, diplomacy, psychology, perception, and above all, decision-making under extreme uncertainty. But throughout this documentary, one question has remained unanswered. The question we introduced in the very first minutes. Why has so much attention reportedly focused on energy infrastructure instead of conventional military targets? At first, it seemed obvious. Oil means money. Money funds governments. Governments fund militaries. Simple. But as we've explored the story, a different picture has begun to emerge. Because energy infrastructure is not just about revenue. It represents leverage, strategic pressure, political signaling, and influence that reaches far beyond the battlefield. Which means the biggest story may never have been about destroying infrastructure at all. It may have been about changing calculations, changing perceptions, changing decisions. And that brings us to the final chapter. The chapter where we connect every piece of the puzzle, the hidden strategic objective, the real stakes, and why the coming days could shape not only the future of the Middle East, but the strategic choices of the entire international community. The answer is more complex than a single military operation, and it explains why this crisis has captured the attention of leaders across the globe. Final chapter, the strategy. Few people talk about what if the most important target in this crisis was never a refinery, never a pipeline, never even a military base. What if the real target was decision-making itself? Throughout history, nations have often used military power not only to destroy physical assets, but to influence the choices of their opponents. In strategic thinking, this is sometimes described as coercive diplomacy, using the threat or limited use of force to try to change another state's calculations. Whether it succeeds depends on many factors and is heavily debated by experts. The objective isn't necessarily to fight the longest war. The objective is to convince the other side that continuing its current course will carry greater cost than changing it. That doesn't always work. Sometimes it reduces tensions, sometimes it hardens positions. But understanding this concept helps explain why infrastructure, military posture, diplomacy, and public messaging can all become part of the same strategy. Because modern conflicts are fought in multiple arenas at once. Look back at everything we've uncovered. We started with reports of possible strikes on Iran's energy infrastructure. At first, it looked like another military headline, but then the picture became larger. We discovered how energy affects national economies, how global markets react to uncertainty, how shipping routes connect continents, how military decisions influence diplomacy, and how perception itself can shape events. Suddenly, the story wasn't only about missiles. It was about leverage, influence, deterrence, and strategic signaling. Now ask yourself this. Why do governments spend so much effort communicating with each other, even during periods of extreme tension? Because wars are not only contests of military strength, they are contests of political will. Every statement, every military exercise, every diplomatic meeting, every deployment sends a message. Sometimes that message is intended to reassure allies. Sometimes it is meant to discourage an adversary from taking further action. And sometimes it is directed at multiple audiences simultaneously. That is why analysts study not just what governments do, but what they say and what they choose not to say. This brings us back to the biggest open loop from the beginning. Why now? The answer is unlikely to be a single event. Geopolitical crises usually develop over months or years, shaped by a combination of security concerns, regional dynamics, domestic politics, and international diplomacy. No single explanation captures the whole picture. Instead, today's tensions are the result of many interconnected decisions made by many different actors. That complexity is exactly why predicting the future is so difficult. The big reveal. Remember the question we asked at the very beginning? Is this really about Iran? Or is there something much bigger happening? Here's the answer. The crisis is certainly about Iran, but it is also about something larger. It is about how nations use military, economic, diplomatic, and informational tools together to shape the strategic environment without allowing events to spiral into a wider conflict. In other words, the struggle is not only over territory or infrastructure, it is also over deterrence, credibility, regional stability, and the future balance of power in the Middle East. That doesn't mean escalation is inevitable. History contains many moments when intense crises were eventually followed by negotiations and de-escalation. It also contains moments where miscalculation led to prolonged conflict. Which path today's leaders choose remains uncertain. Tonight, military planners will continue watching satellite images. Diplomats will continue making phone calls. Energy traders will continue watching every headline. Governments will continue assessing risks. And millions of ordinary people will simply hope that the next headline is not the one that changes everything. Because history rarely announces the moment it is being written. It reveals itself only later. Years from now, people may look back at this period and ask, was this the moment the crisis began to ease? Or the moment the Middle East entered a dangerous new chapter? Today, no one knows the answer. But one thing is certain. The decisions made in moments like these can shape global politics, regional security, and economic stability for years to come. And that is why the world is watching so closely. Because sometimes, The most consequential battles are fought not only on the battlefield, but in the decisions that determine whether the battle ever begins.